So welcome to day 6, our class number 5. We talked about seller disclosures and all of the different forms that you need to look for and ask for when representing actually both sides, but mostly the buyer side as far as what you want to provide to them to make sure that they're getting all their diligence in there that they can to check everything. So today we're going to continue on in the REPC, and we're going to talk about the due diligence condition as far as where that's at, if you find any problems with anything or you want anything resolved. So hopefully everyone can see the screen okay. It should have the buyer's conditions of purchase on there from the REPC. Feel free, if you guys have any questions, comments, or anything during any of this, please jump in there, unmute yourself, and ask away. So I don't want to always be the only one talking. It's kind of boring that way, but anyway, so again, welcome. So the due diligence condition, if you're going to be representing the buyer and you want to make sure that they have every opportunity to do their inspections and everything, of course, you always want to make sure that this box is checked as is conditioned upon buyer's due diligence. What I want to go over is just to make sure that you understand and that you're explaining to them exactly what that means. Of course, you've got the due diligence checklist that you give to them, and that is something that you give to them when you do the buyer broker agreement so that they have that ahead of time. I like to have it also to the side and just have it as a checklist and something they can refer to when it comes to this portion of this, just to make sure we're not missing anything when we're writing up the offer. So on the due diligence items, basically I'm going to read it to you. It's kind of hard to read sometimes on here, but shall consist of the buyer's review and approval of the contents of the seller's disclosures referenced in section 7, and any other tests, evaluations, and verifications of the property deemed necessary or appropriate by the buyer, such as physical condition of the property, the existence of any hazardous substances, environmental issues or geological conditions, square footage or acreage, any improvements to the land, the condition of the roof, the walls, the foundation, plumbing, electrical, mechanical, heating and air systems and fixtures, the condition of all appliances, the cost of the availability of homeowners insurance and flood insurance. Of course, we all know that that's really expensive. So that's something that if it is in a flood zone, you definitely want them to find that out right away. So if you are not reminding them to get their homeowners called, for their homeowners insurance called, to get a quote, that's something that I recommend right away whenever I write an offer for somebody and then we go under contract. Because that's something you don't want to run into later, finding out it's in a flood zone. It may push them up so high that they can't afford the payment anymore. They may not qualify with it. That could be a real issue. So, and if applicable, water sources, availability and quality, the location of property lines, regulatory use restrictions, violations, fees, HOAs, things like that. It also does talk about in here the utility costs and the convicted sex offenders residing in the proximity to the property. A lot of people are concerned about that. You need to make sure that you know where to find that information so you can guide them in the right direction for whatever county or city that you're in. All of the buyer's due diligence shall be paid for by the buyer and shall be conducted by individuals or entities of buyer's choice. Seller agrees to cooperate with the buyer's due diligence and the buyer agrees to pay for any damages resulting in any inspections or tests done to the property. So what I want to point out is on the section here, that was A, which was the due diligence. On B, the buyer's right to cancel or resolve objections. This is something that we run into a lot. And a lot of times I have agents come to me and say, well, yeah, but we tried to get this resolved and they wouldn't do anything, or we gave them notice that day by the deadline by 5 o'clock. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that in this section, if the buyer does want things fixed and they're not okay with the way things went, or they need to address some items, basically if it's unacceptable to the buyer, you can see it here on this section, that the buyer, no later than the due diligence deadline referenced in the section 24B, can cancel the REPC by providing written notice to the seller. Again, I want to state that again. It has to be written. So if you have called you and the agent says, hey, we want to cancel, due to our due diligence. Just telling you that over the phone does not do it. It has to be something in writing from the buyer to the seller and given to the agent so the agent can get that to them. If you don't do that, you could have your buyer go past that deadline and then they could end up losing their earnest money. So be really careful to make sure that anytime there's a notice that needs to be given of any kind, that it's in writing and it's given to the parties, all the parties involved. So if they cancel the REPC by providing the written notice to the seller, then the earnest money shall be released to the buyer without requirement of further written authorization from the seller. Or no later than the due diligence deadline referenced in section 24B, resolve in writing with seller any objections buyer has arising from the buyer's due diligence. So by the due diligence deadline, what that means is it has to be resolved by that date. So if you have a date of August 11th today, that you have your due diligence deadline and you have not resolved the objections with the seller by 5 p.m., then your buyer has basically waived any right to be able to ask them to do anything. So they either move on, or if they haven't canceled it in writing to say they're pulling out, they could lose their earnest money. So be really careful with that. A lot of people run into those situations. So going back to that, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware. I've got a resolution of due diligence addendum that we're going to go over. So if you have a buyer that needs things corrected, fixed, they want a credit, whatever it happens to be that you're going to ask the seller for, make sure that you're using the resolution of due diligence addendum, and we'll go over that here in a minute. The second one here is C, and that is the failure to cancel. Of course, if they fail to cancel by the due diligence deadline in writing to the seller with any objections, if they don't do that, they are going to waive their due diligence, and then at that point, the earnest money becomes non-refundable. So again, I want to really make sure and let you know that you have to make sure that everything is in writing and it has to be resolved by that deadline. That doesn't mean that's the date they have to respond by. Any questions on that portion of it? Welcome everyone else that has signed on, by the way. Okay, so this is your resolution of due diligence addendum, and this is a form that is approved through the UAR and the division. So just so you know, it should be on your MLS forms. So when you're filling this out, there's a couple sections to this that you need to make sure that you are checking or not checking. So the closing costs, of course, there's closing costs that the seller, agrees to pay. So basically on number 1, it says seller and buyer agree that buyer accepts the property as provided in section 2.2 or 10.2 and 3. Seller shall, contribute a settlement amount blank to be applied at buyer's discretion towards any of the following. So that could be a permanent reduction, temporary reduction in the mortgage loan interest rate, mortgage financing costs, closing costs, prepaids. Any unused portion of the seller's contribution may, at the buyer's option, be used to reduce the purchase price. If in a prior addendum, the REPC seller, the seller has agreed to pay an amount towards buyer's closing costs, the amount shown in this section, number 1, shall be in addition to the prior contribution. So if you're going to ask for additional closing costs to be paid besides what you've already asked for, say you've already asked for 2.5% and they already agreed to that on a separate addendum for closing costs, this is not where you're going to, this section is only going to be what you're going to do in addition to that to cover anything that needs to be repaired in the home or that they feel they want to reduce the price for. But just make sure that your seller knows, if you're representing the seller, that they understand this is in addition to those closing costs. Any questions on that section? Okay, so number 2 is the purchase price. So basically what they can do is you can see they can choose which one. So they can choose number 1, which is the closing costs that they can use towards whatever they want. Number 2 would be a price reduction. So if they just want them to reduce the price, a lot of people, a lot of times, if they're doing repairs or whatever, addendums, and they come back, they just kind of put on their new purchase price to be X amount or whatever. What I like about this is it's spelled out, and it's talking about what it's being reduced for, and it's typically going to be reduced for any kind of due diligence that the buyer found to not be acceptable. So seller and buyer agree that the buyer accepts the property as provided in section 2 and 3, and the purchase price shall be reduced, and that the new purchase price will be blank. So that's a spot you could do that basically on due diligence. Or number 3, the repairs to be made by the seller. You have to be really careful with this section because it will go on and to show you for unfinished repairs. We'll go over that here in a minute. But you just have to make sure that if the repairs aren't going to be done in time, or they know that's not something they can do, then you need to make sure that you're checking this bottom section with the 3.1 that goes with number 3. So repairs we're on number 3 here. So repairs to be made by the seller. Seller and buyer agree that seller will be responsible for completion of the repairs by the settlement deadline, unless otherwise agreed to in writing. Seller shall, through contractors, complete the repairs to comply with applicable law, including governmental permits, inspections, and approval requirements. All repairs shall be performed in a workmanlike manner with materials of quality and appearance comparable to existing materials. So then there's a section that I have highlighted here, agreed upon repairs specify, and you can fill that in as much information as you need to. It will just, keep going on the page. What I would suggest is if you are going to do that and you're going to ask for certain things, make sure that you are being very specific about what it is you want fixed, who's going to fix it, how it's going to be fixed, when it's going to be fixed. If there's certain things that need to be done that are not maybe quite so obvious, just spell it out. A lot of times people take it right off of an inspection report. So 3.1 goes along with this number 3 then. So 3.1 says buyer remedies for unfinished repairs. If as the settlement deadline, the repairs have not been completed, then the buyer may enter into an escrow agreement with the seller approved by the lender, if applicable, to finish the repairs after closing, which would be considered the escrow. In the event the seller and buyer cannot agree on the escrow, or it is not approved by the lender, which is usually the case, if applicable, then buyer may alternatively elect one of the following remedies. So basically what it's saying is if we get to the bottom of this, we get to the end, the seller hasn't completed the repairs on number 3 that we talked about, now 3.1 will kick in. If 3.1 kicks in and the lender comes back at the deadline and says, no, we're not going to allow for any escrow because it's work that could be done, or we don't have sufficient bids or whatever it happens to be, then you would need to decide at that point, if that was to happen, what is the buyer going to do at that point if they can't come to any kind of an agreement? And that's where you want to check either A or B. So A, oh, sorry, I don't know what happened here. Uh-oh. So A is buyer may cancel the REPC, and in addition to the return of the earnest money or deposits, if applicable, except from seller as liquidated damages, the sum equal to the earnest money deposit. But that would be only if you were going to cancel. So if they get to the very end and it's supposed to be they're going to settlement and your buyer still wants the house no matter what, you wouldn't want to check A, because that means that they could cancel the REPC at that point, and that the seller saying that they are willing to, at that point, if they didn't do the repairs, agree to liquidated damages. So B is buyer may complete the purchase of the property and then pursue any other remedies available at law after closing. The terms of this section, number 3, inclusive, shall survive closing. So in my opinion, unless you want your seller to be at the end and be like, yeah, we decided we don't want to do the repairs, it says the buyer may cancel, but you may have a situation even that the seller might say, well, that's okay because we're not doing it. We decided we're not selling the home, whatever. It could end up in some kind of a legal situation. And to me, it just leaves it kind of a bad situation all the way around. So, you can choose whatever your buyer decides they want to do, but B would probably be the best option as far as I'm concerned. Due diligence condition. Upon acceptance of this addendum, buyer's objections to the due diligence shall be deemed resolved, and due diligence condition is, sorry, I'm going to move this little, oh, it's not letting me move it. Darn it. It's right in the middle of here. Buyer's objections to the due diligence shall be deemed resolved, and the due diligence condition is waived by buyer unless checked below. And so if they're not waiving it, so basically what you'd want to do in this situation is if the buyer and the seller came to an agreement, yes, this is what's going to happen, these are the repairs that are going to be made. If your buyer's good with that, and then they are moving forward and there's no other things they're going to come up with or want, there's no other, I should say, inspections or any kind of like lead-based paint inspections or anything they're going to have done in addition to that hasn't already been mentioned here that you want done, then that's okay. You wouldn't have to check that. But if there was other tests that were still being done and hadn't came back yet, you would want to check this, that the buyer's due diligence condition is not waived. So be really careful with that form. Make sure if you're using that you are checking what applies for your buyer and keeps them safe. A lot of information I know, but a lot of people don't even know how to use the form or know it's there. That's why I bring it up. A lot of this stuff you're probably not going to use very often, but I just want you to be aware that it's in there. Do you guys have anybody have any questions or comments at this point that they want to throw in there? You'll have to unmute yourself if you want to say anything. Nope. Okay, you guys are awfully quiet. Okay, so as far as appraisal conditions go, so there can be situations where you have a cash buyer, just to make this clear, you could have a cash buyer and they could still make it conditioned upon the appraisal. I've had people say, well, they can't do that because they're paying cash, and that's not true, they can. It's all a matter of what buyer and seller agree to. Matter of fact, I've had people say, well, if they're paying cash, then the financing wouldn't apply either. Yes, no, I guess it kind of depends. If they want to say it does, then they would say no financing required, then they wouldn't worry about that. But if the financing is required and the buyer is obligated to purchase it based off of obtaining anything for their loan, maybe they've got, they're getting a 401k pullout, that they're going to pull money out of their 401 or something like that to use. It could be conditioned upon them getting that. Maybe they don't have it in their hand yet. Yeah, that really wouldn't be considered using cash, but it just depends on what you guys agree to. So financing condition probably isn't as applicable for a cash buyer. Of course, it shouldn't be, but an appraisal could be. So just so you're aware, if you do get a cash offer, it could be subject to appraisal. If the appraisal does come in and it comes in short, or it doesn't come, it's less than what the purchase price is, I've got that highlighted on here in the red for you to make sure that you understand that there's a couple situations that need to happen here. So the buyer has the right to cancel, but if they want to cancel, then they need to, basically, they need to provide the cancellation in writing to the seller with a copy of the notice of appraised value from the lender. So not always does everybody, want that or expect it, but I'm just letting you know that right now, if you're going to release a buyer's earnest money and you're that close to dates and things like that, protect your buyer and make sure that you're sending all the right documentation over to the seller's agent so they can't come back later and say that you never provided any written notice. That could be a situation where you could end up with earnest money being stuck somewhere and nobody releasing it. So the seller wanted to argue that and say, well, we never did get a copy, or we never did get a written notice that it came in low, and they went ahead and canceled, then you could have a situation where the earnest money could be disputed and then they wouldn't release it. So the failure to cancel, though, is if you do not send over a cancellation in writing to let them know, and you go past that deadline, then obviously the earnest money becomes non-refundable at that point. So again, make sure it's always in writing.
Cindy?
Uh-huh.
Where do you find an appraiser that's not with the bank, just for a cash buyer? Like, is that something that iPro has names of, or is that, how do you get that instead of, if you're not going through a bank, because that's where you usually get the appraiser from?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It depends on, so if you're doing, most of the time, if somebody's doing an appraisal and it's not going to be based off of financing, obviously, then it wouldn't have to be an FHA appraiser or whatever. This is the problem with that, is people decide they want to get an appraisal done on a home. And what happens is a lot of times they don't tell the appraiser, oh, well, this just happened not too long ago with a deal in our office. And what happened is the buyer decided to get the appraisal done, but they didn't tell the appraiser that they were buying the home. They just said they were wondering what the house was worth. So they went and had an appraisal done, and it came in really low because they didn't, right or wrong, they didn't know that there was a purchase price, how much the purchase price was or anything. So it came in really, really low. And so the buyer came back and said, oh, well, we had an appraisal done, it didn't come in. So, you definitely, if somebody wants to do an appraisal, you would want to let them know, you would want to give the appraiser a copy, obviously, of the purchase contract to see, so they know what's included, what they're counting, what they're not counting. But a lot of times you just have to call around to find out if there's any appraisers that are available that will do that. And it depends on the area. So I see a lot of people put on the Facebook group that everybody's in through the Wasatch Front. They'll ask, anybody know of a good appraiser that can do an appraisal on a home? And a lot of times there'll be 2 or 3 names that'll pop up on there. So it really does depend on the area that you're into, or Google it, I guess. And then read the reviews, make sure that they're legit.
Thank you.
Yeah, you don't see that very often. Most of the time, especially in the way that things have been in the economy and the market now, people just pretty much have a good idea of how much they're worth. So if they're paying cash, they're just usually most of the time willing to pay whatever the person's asking or whatever they've agreed to. But once in a while, you do run into somebody that decides they're going to get an appraisal, and it kind of, puts a kink in things. So, okay. So again, we just talked about the financing condition. If it's not conditioned upon getting financing, then you would check financing is not required. So just what I would say is check that really diligently when you're looking at it, especially if you're working with the seller. Because the buyer could throw that, the buyer's agent could put in there financing required, but then on the front page put in there that it's a cash offer or something. And if you don't catch that, then you could end up stuck waiting for financing deadlines and all those kind of things to pass. So, okay, so when it comes to the financing, same thing. The buyer's right to cancel before is basically if a buyer's not satisfied with the terms of the condition or the conditions of the loan, you can cancel for any reason. It doesn't really matter what it is. Doesn't even mean that they're not qualified. If they come back and say, you know what, we pulled this up and based off of this, now your interest rate's going to be a little bit higher, or you have to pay, more closing costs or points or something like that. They can actually pull out for those kind of things. But if they're not satisfied with any of the terms and conditions, then they may, after the due diligence deadline. So I want you to notice that it says in there after the due diligence deadline. It doesn't say after the finance and appraisal deadline. The reason I'm pointing that out is because you could put your buyers in a really bad position based on when you're doing things if you don't do it right. Most agents probably don't even realize that it says that in there, so they probably wouldn't say anything. But just in case, I just want you to know that if it's after the due diligence deadline, that's when it would need to be, if applicable. Cancel the RIPSI by providing written notice to the seller no later than the financing and appraisal deadline. So no later than that date. Whereupon, and there is an amount there that you could actually have. So if you were writing an offer for somebody and you were up against a whole bunch of other people, you knew that was the situation, just make sure that if they're going to increase their earnest money, that's where you would put it. But what you're doing there is saying that if they do cancel it after that point, that portion of the buyer's earnest money shall be released to the seller. So I had an offer come in the other day. I was reviewing and helping a newer agent with and stuff, and it came in and they had put that amount right on that section where the little circle is. They put that as being the same as what the earnest money was. So they were going to give up all the earnest money, and it was a big amount of earnest money. It was like $7,000. So just be really careful not to put on there that it's going to be released. If you're going to, add extra money in there to make it more appealing, try not to let your buyers lose their earnest money. So buyer's right to cancel after the financing and appraising deadline. So if after the expiration, oh wait, I want to back up a minute. So basically what you would put here is, let's say they had given you a $5,000 earnest money and you were up against a whole bunch of other people. You wanted to get the deal. The buyer said, I don't care what it takes. I'll give up half of my earnest money if I have to, if for some reason we don't end up getting our financing or the appraisal comes in low or whatever happens to be. If that's where you would put that, out of the $5,000 earnest money, you could, put 2,000 of it would be released to the seller, or whatever it happens to be. Just make sure you're not putting the number there unless it's something that your buyer's agreed to losing, because that's what that is. So the buyer's right to cancel after the financing and appraisal deadline. Again, everything has to be in writing, so you want to give everything in, written form to the other agent. Make sure that they're giving it to their client. So if the buyer fails to obtain the loan, meaning the proceeds of the loan have not been delivered by the lender to the escrow closing office as required under Section 3.2, which is what we went over, then buyer shall not be obligated to purchase the property, and buyer and seller may cancel the REPC by providing written notice to the other party. So I want to make it really clear that you guys understand, if your buyers don't show up to closing, your sellers show up to sign, they find out buyer didn't qualify or whatever, you still need to send a cancellation letter from the seller to the buyers to let them know that they canceled the contract due to that situation. Because when they release the buyer's earnest money to the seller, it has to be in order of everything that's supposed to happen, which means that they would need to have given a written notice. So if the buyer doesn't cancel it, then the seller needs to cancel it. One or the other needs to cancel and give some kind of a notification. The best way you could do that is you could do the resolution of earnest money that you could send over, but that makes it look like a buyer needs to sign it, which isn't necessarily true. Most of all, put it in writing that your seller is canceling due to the fact that they did not close on time. And make sure that that cancellation is being sent after 5 p.m. that day, if that was the agreed to time, which is typically what it is 5 p.m. Mountain Time. So buyer's earnest money, you can see you've got I, and I. So in that bottom portion where it says earnest money deposit to be released to the seller, buyer agrees that all the buyer's earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, shall be released to the seller without the requirement of further written authorization from the buyer. And then when they do that, when the seller agrees to take the earnest money and keep that, they're saying that that is their acceptance to any remedy or liquidated damages. So they can't take their earnest money and then sue them. They either don't take the money and then sue them, or if they accept it, then obviously, they're accepting that as their liquidated damages. Any questions on that? That's a little bit confusing, I know. Most of all, just make sure that whoever's canceling, it's in writing, I guess is what you want to make sure you do here. Okay, so this 8.4, there is a section that says additional earnest money deposit. So if you have a buyer that says, you know what, we're going to give, I put a little portion of it down here. So on number 2, you could see on 2.1, payment of purchase price, it has everything defined down here for you. So it's got earnest money deposit. Of course, that would be the initial earnest money deposit. 8.4 that I have on here is additional earnest money. So if you wanted to really have a solid offer, something that you really want to push through, so that maybe you were up against other offers and you wanted to say, we're going to give you $5,000 earnest money now, but then we're going to do an additional earnest money. And we will do that of $3,000, $2,000, whatever it happens to be. On here that reads that if the REPC has not been previously canceled by the buyer, as provided in sections 8.1, 2, and 3, which is the due diligence deadlines, and financing and appraisal deadline, whichever is later, the buyer will or will not deliver to the buyer's brokerage an additional earnest money deposit in the amount of blank. The earnest money deposit and additional earnest money deposit, if applicable, are sometimes referred to as deposits. Earnest money deposit or deposits shall be credited towards the purchase price at closing. This is not a section that says that the seller gets to keep that extra. The one we just reviewed is the one that talks about them losing that they would not get that portion back. So when you're filling out section 2 on the purchase contract on the front page, make sure if you're going to put an additional amount here, where you can see the yellow box that I put around there, if you're going to put $2,000 there, you need to put $2,000 down here on line 2. You need to make sure that they're matching up. If you're not doing an additional earnest money amount, put 0. Just put a 0 there and put will not up here in the checkbox. And then you would not even put anything on line 2 where it's on number 2. But make sure it all matches up. Any questions on that? Well, you guys are really easy today. Either that or I've just totally confused you or bored you to death, one of the two. Okay, so on number 9, we've got the addenda. So anything that's going to be included with the purchase contract when you're writing the offer, make sure that you are addressing it right here. Even if it's things that are going to be, if you're going to have, say, for instance, you're going to do an addendum number 1, and then your next addendum is going to be number 2, whatever it happens to be. But then if there's an addendum that doesn't have a number or something that needs to be addressed, there's clauses that can be put in that, each one of them. Make sure that you're addressing whatever it happens to be here. And I've got a few examples of a few additional addendums that you may include, and they can either be an addendum on their own or they can be an addendum with several things. And the reason I did it this way is I want you to notice that if somebody does addendum number 1 and clicks on there, that addendum 1 is included. But on addendum 1, it has several clauses that they've downloaded onto there. I've seen where agents miss those. So like they'll see like the first statement that's on there or something. Or for instance, they put, you know, it's one addendum that has a certain spelled out seller's contributions or something. And then at the bottom, it has another section where they've downloaded the clauses that are in the addendum that you can actually have it just add in there. Make sure you're reviewing that whole addendum, because sometimes it looks like it's part of the wording that was already there as far as buyer and seller agree to accept this addendum. It can have a lot more information on there that you may miss if you're not reviewing those really thoroughly. So make sure that you're looking for that. One of those things that can go on there is a flexible settlement deadline. If you haven't used one of these before, I wouldn't, unless it's an absolute necessary have to do it. I had a situation that I did that one time, and basically what it is it gives the buyer and the seller the okay to say, okay, yeah, I want to close sooner or later. We're going to close. It's not going to be an exact date, but so your settlement deadline will not be, you know, August 11th. It can be a flexible settlement deadline. And if it's not stated in there correctly, and if it's not, if somebody decides they're closing, either side decides they're closing and they don't give written notice to the other party in time, it doesn't matter. So you could have somebody that says, hey, we're ready to close. We're closing on this day. And now the seller said, no, we're not closing on that day. We're going to wait until the end of this, which is down here. That runs into a real issue. So just be really careful if you're using that one, read through it, make sure that you're keeping everybody safe. The other one is seller contributions of closing costs. Make sure that whatever amount you're putting here, you're putting a full amount of what they need. If it's going to be 2.5%, so something that I've noticed happen is seller's contributions to closing costs. Let's say, for instance, your buyer needs 2.5% of closing costs of the purchase price. And you figure out what the purchase price is that you're offering, and you figure out what 2.5% is, and you put that amount in there. and then it comes back and gets renegotiated. Either the seller counters back and either lower or raises the price, or something goes down on that number or something. What happens is you've already got the set amount. And so if the price goes up, which is what it's typically doing in the market now, if the house went from 350,000 and now it's creeped all the way up to 370,000 because there's so many people that are bidding on it, but you've only adjusted for the closing costs to be enough for 2 or 350, the seller or the buyer may come in short, and if they don't have the cash for that, there could be a real issue at the end. So if you're talking to the lender and they're absolutely saying you have to have 2.5% of the purchase price, just type in 2.5% of the purchase price right there on that line of the agreed purchase price. Number 3, disclosure of principal as a licensee. Today in my our meeting for my office, I talked about this because if you guys read the division's newsletter, the second quarter newsletter that just came out, if you read through that, you will see that there's a lot of people that are getting in trouble for not disclosing who they are in the transaction or representing in the transaction. And a lot of people are getting in trouble for not disclosing that they're either a licensee or that they're not disclosing brokerage they're with, or that they are a principal in the process. So basically meaning that they're one of the buyers. So make sure that if you are representing somebody that you're using this, if it's a relative, and if you're not sure if it's close enough relative to you to worry about, just put it in there. It won't make that much difference, but at least it's disclosed. And if it's personal interest and you're purchasing it, or you're part of an entity that's purchasing it, you have to disclose on there that you're part of that. And so if you're the buyer or the seller, or you're the real estate agent in it, you need to make sure that you're clicking on that disclosure. Subject to the seller acquiring a new residence. If you guys haven't seen this one, it does talk about in there that it is subject to a sell, or that the subject to the sell is that the seller has to find a new home. That can be really, really tricky. So just make sure that if you see that, that you're following the contract, you're following up with it, you're hopefully not getting your buyers in any kind of a situation where they've spent a ton of money on their appraisal and inspections and all those kind of things. And then all of a sudden at the end, the seller pulls out and says, well, we never did find a home, so we're not going to buy it. That's what that is. 1031 exchange, you probably don't work with these a ton, but if somebody's buying a property because they just sold another property that is an investment property and they want to roll it over so they don't have to pay the taxes on it, they're just going to keep rolling it, that's what a 1031 would be. If that's the case, you need to make sure that you're protecting your buyer or seller, that they have that in there. So that's another one that could be in there. There's just so many, and I don't want to overwhelm you with all these different ones. And I'm not going to go through each one, explain exactly what they all mean, because there's just too much information there. But if you know that you're in the situation where you need to use that, or you have a client that is in that situation, make sure you're reviewing it. And if you don't understand it, get with your broker and have them explain it to you. Okay, so one of the other things is the COVID-19 addendum. So right now I see agents saying, yes, I'm using it. And then I see others that say, absolutely not, I'm not using it if we don't have to. It really needs to be up to your clients, and you need to explain to them that there are situations now where, either due diligence deadlines are getting passed because you can't get an inspector in there. But basically, I'm going to read this to you so that you understand what it is. The buyer and seller acknowledge that the current spread of COVID-19 may cause unanticipated delays or render the REPC impossible or commercially unreasonable for buyer or seller to perform their respective contractual obligation. Some of those things are, can include but aren't limited to. So they're not limited to just these things, but there are a few of them. Number 1 is a confirmed diagnosis of COVID. Number 2 is a mandatory or self-imposed quarantine of the buyer or the seller. So if the buyer has made an offer and the due diligence deadline's close and all these things are happening, but the buyer's not able to get in there to do things they need to do. Things are, they're in quarantine, or the seller's in quarantine and now they can't do their home inspections, things like that. Hospitalization of the buyer or seller, even during this. It doesn't say that it has to be, it has to be COVID-19 related, but it also says that it's not limited to those either. So be really careful. You can get into trouble when you start telling people, yeah, but we have this so we can push it out. There may be, things that you have to produce for documentation showing that that was the case. So the local or federal imposed travel restrictions, that could be an issue. Underwriting or loan processing delays. So that's a real issue because everybody's working from home. So they're not getting their loans done as quickly as they were before. Maybe the appraisers aren't being able to get out and do the appraisal. There's just all kinds of things that can be, that they can run into. The delay with escrow and title services, and any other COVID-19 related issue that is not within reasonable control of the buyer or seller. So one of them on number 2 is automatic extension of the due diligence deadline, if applicable. So in the event the seller is unable to allow the buyer access to the property to conduct their due diligence due to the COVID, it doesn't mean that they have COVID. It doesn't mean that it's because the buyer or the seller is sick. The seller could say, I don't want people coming through my house right now. There's just something going on, or we're not in good health. So if that's the case, then the due diligence deadline shall automatically be extended by the time period that the buyer is unable to access the property. So what that means is, you get a hold of the seller's agent and they tell you, you know what, the seller said you guys can't come out for a week. They need to let this pass. They've got some things going on or whatever. Then if you lose 7 days, that would be the extended period of time. So you need to document that. So make sure that you're keeping track if you're using this. Automatic extension of the finance and appraisal deadline, if applicable, of course, is the same situation with that one. Then the finance appraisal shall automatically be extended for the time period that the buyer is unable to access for the same exact reasons. So if it was 7 days that the seller said you can't come in or something like that, or 10 days, it would automatically extend. However, like I said, you want to make sure it's in writing. So if you have an agent that is sending you information over saying the seller saying that they don't want you in there for a week or whatever, make sure it's by email or something in writing that you have that you can show to keep track of things in case it goes south or something goes wrong. And then number 4 is right to extend the settlement deadline. So the buyer or seller shall have the right to extend the settlement deadline due to COVID up to 30 days by providing written notice to the other party on or before the settlement deadline. So if you're supposed to be closing on a property and you're representing the seller and they're going to close on August 30th, and you get a notice on the 29th of August that they need an extension, they do have the right to do that if it is COVID related. So you need to make sure that when you're explaining this addendum to your seller or buyer, because the seller could say, we need another 30 days because we've got sick or something. It can go either way, but either way, it has to be in notice, or written notice. So I'm just making you aware that you could get almost at the settlement deadline, and if something came up, there could be a 30-day extension. So explain that to your clients when you're talking about this. Any questions on the COVID addendum? Nope. Are you guys still there? Just want to make sure everyone's still there. Okay, so on the division website, there is an approved form for a survey addendum. However, I didn't find it on the MLS when I was trying to find this. And so I just want you to be aware, sometimes you run into a situation where there's a survey that needs to be done. And instead of trying to write it up yourself, go in and at least look on the approved forms through the division and pull this up first and see if it covers what you need, and make sure that you use it and not just your own verbiage as far as on an addendum. Okay, so that would be if there's any survey work to be done, there's a deadline on here, how many calendar days that they would have to either get it done or accept it, to either complete the work or review the contents of the survey work. It also talks about how much acreage it is and things like that. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this because most of you will never use this. I just want you to be aware that if you do need something that has to do with the survey, that it is on the division's website under the approved forms. Okay, so any questions up to this point on any of that or anything you want me to go back over and review with you? It's a lot of information, huh? Sometimes it's kind of overwhelming even when I'm trying to explain it to people, that it's just, it seems like there's so much. And if you've been in the business a while, then you probably just go like, oh yeah, I knew that, or yeah, you know, I've heard of that or whatever. But when you're a newer agent, this is just a lot of information and it can be really overwhelming. So what I would suggest is just read it really well. And if you still don't understand it so that you can explain it, definitely check with your broker and have them go over it with you. I thought I heard maybe somebody was commenting. Not sure.
I did see the MLS, they had the Alta survey. I haven't seen that one before either.
Yeah, the Alta survey is for commercial properties.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I know because when I pulled it up, I was trying to pull this up. And when it pulled up, I was like, oh no, that's not the right one. That one's for a commercial property only. So yeah, that's why I was really surprised this wasn't on the MLS. I don't know if they just missed it. So I'll just have to maybe send a little message over or something, but it was kind of weird to me that it was on the division's website, but it's not on the MLS for an approved form. So, but good catch. It's good that you noticed that. And on all of those, that's kind of, you know, if you're looking for something, if you're not really sure, and what I would suggest is that if you've got something that needs to be addressed with your buyer or your seller and you need to counter back on something or do an addendum, I go through and just try to pull it on the MLS first to see if I can find it any words that I might have that it applies to. If not, of course, I'll ask around your office to see if anybody knows or whatever. But for the most part, usually the division's website is the approved forms that we get. And so, but I did notice that not all of them are on there. So it is kind of hit and miss on those. Okay, so home warranty plan and as is condition of the property. If you're going to include a home warranty with the home, don't miss this section. If you have a home that's older, and I would say even 5 to 10 years and older at you know, minimum, it's always nice to include that home warranty plan. I just feel like no matter what, it always helps my buyers out. And if I'm the listing agent, I let them know that, you know what, it makes the buyer feel more secure about the home, that if there is anything that comes up. As far as what home warranty company you go through, you know, you've got to just talk with your buyers and decide what works best for them. But, you know, looking at reviews and things like that, if you've used, you know, people over and over in the past, you know, you can always refer them out to 2 or 3 different places. But definitely make sure that whoever it is that they're going to use, make sure that you look and see what's on their home warranty and what's covered, and make sure it's everything that the buyer wants. And make sure that if there's more information or, you know, something that needs to be covered, such as a well or septic tanks and things like that, that may not be automatically included with the home warranty as far as the basic plans go. If that's something really important, it needs to be covered, you know, make sure that you're putting that in there and, you know, adjusting the price accordingly. And if not, then make sure your buyer's aware that there's additional costs that they can add that to the policy at closing. But I noticed that there's a lot of people that will just kind of like check on here that a home warranty is included, and they put the amount shall not exceed 400 or 500 or whatever it is. And it will be ordered by the buyer usually and selected by the buyer's company. Anyway, whoever is paying for it, that's fine. But just make sure that when you're putting the order in for that it is getting ordered, that you are giving them the documentation and everything, the pamphlets they need to make sure they're covered. The condition of the property acknowledgement. So this is all as is, and that's what this is falling under. If you're working with the seller, though, definitely make sure that you're showing them a buyer due diligence checklist and show them those are a lot of, things that the seller or that the buyer's going to be looking for. And just ask the seller right out, hey, do you have an issue with any of these things that we need to be aware of? So when they're putting it on their seller disclosures, it is being covered, so the buyer's aware. But the condition of the purchase or of the property for the buyer acknowledgement on 10.2, buyer acknowledges and agrees that in reference to the physical condition of the property, buyer is purchasing the property in as-is condition without expressed or implied warranties of any kind. So how many times have you guys worked with a buyer or somebody working with a buyer, and the buyer comes back and said, well, you know what, I wanted to cover this and I didn't know about this and I didn't know about that, or I wanted to do this and this and this. If you are explaining to your buyer when they're writing up the offer that the purchase is as-is condition, but they do have their due diligence deadline that they can work with, that they can go through everything to evaluate and inspect the property, they have the right to do that. And so they need to know that, but they also need to know that if they don't, that it is an as-is condition. And that's why with iPro, we actually have a home warranty inspection, third-party inspection, that if they're going to waive that and they don't want to have an inspection done, that's fine. They can do that, but it needs to be signed so that it says that you actually let them know that we suggest that they get one. And that's why that's there. So then they would have the right to inspect the property and do their evaluations. And based off their due diligence, they elect to, if they decide to proceed with the purchase, the buyer is relying wholly on the buyer's own judgment, and that any of the contractors or inspectors engaged by the buyer to review, evaluate, and inspect the property. So make sure that you're letting your buyer order the home warrant or the home inspection. Any of the testing that's being done, make sure they're ordering that and not you. You don't want to be liable for having to pay a bill because you ordered it and then they come after you because the buyer didn't pay it, for some reason. Most of them collect up front, so it's usually not an issue. But I have seen in the past where like a termite inspection was done and then they had the termite people come in and fix things and do whatever, and it was the agent that had ordered it for the seller and said go ahead and do it, and they didn't have anything in writing saying that, or the seller didn't order it themselves, and the buyer or the seller's agent ended up paying the bill. So 10.3, condition of the property and seller's acknowledgements. Again, seller acknowledges and agrees that in reference to the physical condition of the property, the seller agrees to disclose in writing to buyer defects in the property known to the seller, which would be our seller disclosures, basically, that materially affect the value of the property that can't be discovered by a reasonable inspection. And B, buyer or to a prudent buyer. And then B, carefully review, complete, and provide the buyer a written seller property condition disclosure. So these are kind of going through all the things. Honestly, I don't know that a lot of agents really realize that that's in there for them to talk to their seller about. They always assume that everything in here is in reference to the buyer. So just make sure that they are understanding this is really important, I think. That when you're talking with your sellers and you're going through this, is not only just the disclosures is important, but on C, deliver the property to the buyer in substantially the same general condition it was on the date of acceptance. Ordinary wear and tear accepted, but that's ordinary wear and tear. So when you talk to your sellers, please pass on to them that, not everybody's idea of clean is the same, but D, deliver the property to the buyer in broom clean condition and free of debris and personal belongings, and that any repairs that the seller needs to make of any damage from moving out, that they need to make sure they're doing or paying for. I have had probably more in the past 4 or 5 months, I've had more agents come to me and say, I cannot believe how these sellers left this property for these buyers. It's just ridiculous. Like, it's so bad that who would even live like that, let alone leave it like that for somebody else. Do your walkthrough inspection. And if you're not doing your walkthrough at least, no sooner than 7 days prior to your settlement, that's the time to really notice. And it is hard when people are still in there to see what it's going to look like behind the couch or under the couch or, whatever. But for the most part, I think it's just important for us as agents, if we're representing our sellers, to make sure they understand how important it is to clean up the place so that the buyer has a home that they're walking into that is something they could actually live in when they walk in and don't have garbage that they have to get rid of and things like that. So like I said, some people just have a different idea of clean. So it's kind of tough sometimes to have that conversation with them and get them to understand. But if you don't have the conversation, then they won't know at all. So I'm going to end it right there because we're almost at an hour and I don't want to get too much into the next section because it's going to take a little longer. But I would like to answer any questions, or if anybody has any comments on any of this, even situations you ran into that you've had to learn the hard way. If you want to share your experiences with us, feel free. Nobody? Nobody has any experiences they want to How about you, Tim? You're the only one I can see. Oh, there's Richard. I can see Richard now.
You know, I've had situations where there's been quite a list of repairs that have been required, but fortunately, we were able to get them done and get closed. So there have been one or two issues that we've had to negotiate through, but that's life.
Yeah. It's not always going to go completely perfect, but I think it's just being aware. And I do think sometimes we get in such a hurry to get the contract done, make sure everything in the timeline goes right, that the lender gets what they need, and we get get everything done. And I think sometimes we forget to talk about the smaller things that seem small anyway, but make a big difference. Because I know that a lot of times that final ending is what everybody remembers. They don't remember the great experience through the whole thing and what a great job you did. But then all of a sudden you close and then you go let your buyers in the house and it's disgusting and it's a mess. And now all of a sudden you're stuck with having to deal with that. And I think sometimes just making a phone call even prior to and saying, hey, can you mention to your sellers that when we were in there the other day doing our walkthrough, we seen this, and this that needs to be cleaned up. And the garbage that's sitting on the side of the garbage cans needs to go. Where they don't, my buyers don't want to be responsible for hauling that away. They have no way to do that. Now, if it gets done or not, that's a different story, but at least, being their voice, I guess. Richard, did you have something that you wanted to share?
No, I was just answering your question earlier that I don't have any experience with it, so this is all new for me.
Yeah. Well, and every deal is different, so we all know that nothing is ever the same in any situation. But I do know that reaching out to people around you in your office and stuff sometimes to say, hey, what would you do in this situation? Or if you have this happen, really is helpful, So anyone else? James, you got anything you want to add?
My experience has always been it's during the appraisal where repairs come in. And if you haven't left room for that on the contract, so it's important when you walk through yourself that you kind of, even though you may not be a contractor or something, you got to try to get an idea, especially during the home inspection. Okay, how much repairs are we looking here? And make sure you got that covered in the contract from the very beginning, and especially on an FHA loan where there's a spot specifically for that. And so I've never had the issue because I always had that little margin set in there for repairs. My minimum is 500 and it goes up from there.
Yeah.
And, but if you see major things when you're walking through, you better talk to your client about that and make sure there's enough to cover any kind of repairs like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, you're right with FHA and VA, it's hard to know what they're going to come back and want. And so if you are seeing things that, could be an issue, peeling paint that needs to be fixed and, just all those details of small things that you don't think about, and you already know you're working with a seller that isn't willing to negotiate anything or give up anything or do repairs, then yeah, make sure that you're getting that in there so that if the appraiser comes back and said these things need to be done and you've got $5,000 or $6,000 or $1,000 in there, at least you've got that money, it's covered in there, and they can't come back at that time and say, no, we're not going to do it. At least the money's there to cover those.
And it's really protecting their appraisal money too.
Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah. So yeah, great information. Anybody else have anything they want to share? Nope. Are you guys all going to be on the Zoom call on Friday for the drawing?
No doubt. Believe me.
Yes.
Cool. Good. There's some really neat prizes. we were supposed to do it yesterday, and so I had planned a trip. And so I'm going to be out of town, but I'm going to be on the Zoom conference. So I won't be able to actually pull out the tickets to do the drawing, but I will be on there. So I wish you guys all good luck that you at least win something. I don't know about the trips because, right now you don't even know if you can go anywhere. So maybe you're better off to win the other prizes. I don't know. So,
I hope I get layaway.
what's that?
I hope I'm going to win that trip on layaway.
Right? I know. Go in and say, hey, what do they call them when you walk in the store and ask them for a
Rain check.
rain check? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
I just went through 2 hours with my son. He's applying for a captain's position at the fire department. They gave him some scenarios, like 5 of them, that they have to fill out and write exactly what you would do in this situation. And so he did it all and came over and said, can you just proofread this for me and see what you think? And so we sat here forever and I went over all these words and stuff, and now I'm just brain dead. I can't even think of a couple words like a rain check. So, but anyway, well, I appreciate you guys being here, and have a good rest of your week, and stay safe and healthy. And if you have any questions on any of this at any time, hit your brokers up. If they're busy, give me a call anytime.
Thanks, Sandy. Appreciate it.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
You're
Thanks.
welcome.
Have a good trip.
Thank you.